Good afternoon and welcome, everybody, to the October Gallery. I'm pleased to see that so many people have come because I think we are going to have a conversation. I want to introduce, first of all, Joe Nickols, who's come over from the British Museum. So many of you will know the samurai show that's on at present. And Joe is one of the co-curators of that show. And so he knows a huge amount about the arts of Japan, the culture and history of Japan. And I, who spent some time in Japan, have a certain understanding of things. But I want to bring in Joe's particular expertise. When we showed Yoshida, so we're talking about the work of Kenji Yoshida, whose work surrounds us in the gallery today. Yoshida's no longer with us. He was a very, very good friend of the gallery in the late 90s and early 2000s. And we're really sorry that he's gone. But I have a feeling when the show is hung, I have a wonderful feeling of welcoming back an old friend. And there's so much life and vitality to the paintings that I feel he's with us today. So, without further ado, I'll tell maybe a short story. We showed Yoshida's work at Frieze Masters last year, and I was explaining. I have a Yoshida spiel, I suppose I'd call it, to try to tell people quite quickly what they were looking at. And one day, somebody walked in who said Yoshida, and walked around and knew at least as much as I did about the paintings. But I could see in your eyes, Joe, I could see the delight. And I thought, I don't know who this person is. They know Yoshida. They like Yoshida. And so we had an immediate, I hope, kinship. So I wanted to get Joe to talk about Yoshida, how he found him, and what you find most interesting in him. When did you first come across Yoshida?
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real joy to be speaking about Yoshida Kenji. I discovered Yoshida Kenji through the British Museum. We have Yoshida Kenji's archive as part of our collection, and we had a solo show of Yoshida's work in 1993, and that was curated by one of the former keepers of the Asia Department, Lawrence Smith, who connected with October Gallery to bring that into the British Museum collection. And even though today we're looking at paintings, the British Museum has a large collection of Yoshida's prints, as well as paintings and other works. But it was through these prints that I really started to connect with Yoshida and his artistry. And I found them very moving. There's a lot of emotion within it. And I think, hopefully, we'll discuss this in this talk, because what Yoshida mentions is this idea of connecting with a universal cry, a universal spirit, a universal echo that is connected about the beauty and significance of life. And I think I was looking at them when I was feeling quite emotional, and I found a resonance within that. And I think it's interesting as well. Just before this talk, we were mentioning about, are we listening to Yoshida? And I think that was a very poignant use of words. I don't know if you meant them in that way, but I think Yoshida's work is all about trying to listen to somebody who is essentially shouting into a void about an experience, about a connection. And I think that I just happened to be at the right place and in the right institution to be able to connect with the works. And so when I came to Frieze and I looked around a corner and there was a room full of them, I was just sort of overjoyed. And I was so pleased that people were Frieze is an international institution, and so it was very powerful to have that idea that all of these influential people were going to be forced almost to listen to Yoshida's cry. So I was very, very impressed with the presentation.
No, I love that idea. We're going to be quite emotional, Joe. It's all right to be emotional because that's what we're talking about. The other evening, we opened the show, and David Elliott came and gave a wonderful introduction in which he put together Yoshida's life. And we'll need at some stage just to put the stepping stones of Yoshida's life together. But he said, so Yoshida essentially, he's a young boy growing up in Japan. One of his brothers loves art, loves Western art, but he's growing up during, he's born in what, 32 or something. He's growing up during what becomes, no, 32, but 28 maybe, let's say. He's growing up during what becomes the Japanese invasion of China, and the Second World War, which to us begins in 39 in Europe, is predated by things over in Asia. And so for the Japanese, the Second World War is not 5 or 6 years, it's about 7 or 8 or 9. There are incidents in China and so on. So it's a much longer thing. Yoshida grows up and goes through school and becomes very interested in art at school. But when he finishes school at the age of 19, it's 1944. And he doesn't have any choice, but he's conscripted and gets assigned to the Japanese Naval Air Force, the IJNAS. So he goes to learn to fly. But by the end of 1944, the Japanese have a new plan, in a sense, to try to put some pressure on. They know they're losing the war. They know there's not much fuel left. There aren't many planes left. The Japanese Navy has basically been sunk. And so the plan is to create this kamikaze, squadrons of kamikaze. Yoshida is assigned to a kamikaze squadron. So there was no sense that you were a volunteer and say, look, I will go. He was told, you're in squadron such and such. You're going to train to dive into an American battleship or a British battleship. Okay? So in a sense, he lives with this awful situation of all the people he's trained with. One day, their name appears on a roster, and the next morning they take off and they don't come back. And gradually, as 44 ends and 45 begins, the chances of Yoshida being called to do the same duty become more and more likely. And this, Yoshida would never talk about this. I tried to get some information from him. He wouldn't talk, which I think is probably correct. That wasn't what he was interested in. The experience wasn't about that. But what, in a sense, saves Yoshida in this awful sense is the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because with that, Japan collapses and suddenly goes into surrender. And all those pilots trained to take the last few airplanes and hit American and British ships, they all survived. Now, there's a curious thing that happens, and I've been talking about this with Joe earlier. They trained about 6,700 kamikaze pilots, and about half that number went and performed the ultimate sacrifice, shall we say, for the country, for the emperor. So that means that about 3,000 survived. And what happens after the war is rather curious, because the Japanese had a sense of embarrassment about the fact that he didn't go. You know, my son went and paid the ultimate sacrifice, but this person survived. And so there was a curious attitude towards the survivors of the kamikaze squadrons. How do you deal with that? I haven't talked too deeply with you, Joe, about this. How would you frame that, given again that you're talking about the samurai and the whole samurai spirit? Can you link it into what you're...
Yes. So at the moment, as you say, I'm one of the curators of the Samurai exhibition at the British Museum, and
which is well worth seeing. Joe can't say that, I can.
Thank you. It's and within the exhibition, we touch on the use of samurai imagery in the rise of militarism and colonialism and the Second World War and the Pacific War. And at the end of this section, we have 3 works of art by artists who participated in the Second World War, one of which is Yoshida Kenji, the other is the ceramicist Hayashi Yasuo, and the other is by a Japanese-American called Shinkichi Tajiri, who fought for the Allies. And so we have a very interesting dialogue between these three artists who are able to reflect on their experiences of war. And I think it's a very interesting display because we are essentially displaying work by people who were sent to die. Nobody expected any of those three artists to return from conflict. And the fact that they all did meant that they had this second life. And I think that that second life is a very complicated experience to endure or to receive. And many of them have commented on not necessarily understanding upon reflection what they were dying for, what they were actually being told to do. And there's some very interesting research into the kamikaze or the special attack force, reflecting on that, reflecting on how it was formed. And the reason why we include these references in the samurai exhibition is because they're so strongly associated in popular culture with this romantic ideal of samurai loyalty, which is a 19th century sort of romanticization of the samurai history. And so it's a very complicated element to unpack because we so believe in this samurai that is unwaveringly loyal and fighting for within some kind of righteous framework. But actually, the samurai historically were very pragmatic. There are lots of examples of samurai fighting on all different sides of conflict, depending on who were paying them and funding them. And when the money ran out, they'd swap sides. So it's this romantic ideal of ultimate samurai sacrifice is something that we've really bonded to in the 20th century, and that's a lot to do with Nitobe Nazo's book Bushido, The Soul of the Samurai, which was first written in English in 1899, and when it was published in 1910 in Japanese, a lot of the historians within Japan were very critical of these ideas. They were very confused about where they were coming from, but that book had a big impact in how America and Europe perceived Japan, and that even had an impact in the Second World War. The Americans really never believed that Japan would surrender, and so that fed into how they planned attacks. And I think that then you have this response by Japan as well, and it all boils down to this sort of imaginary other. And I think these artists who are reflecting on their experience having been sent to die are really confronting that imaginary other. Yes.
I can pick up so many things. This is what I love about having Joe. He comes from different angles, but a lot of the things that you point out in the foreground and background agree with things that I'd like to talk about. Now, what I thought I'd do, because I don't know, many people in England in particular don't necessarily think a lot about samurai. The same kinds of conversations were being had in the First World War and in the Second World War about, the poets who were in the trenches, who were being killed for what, and so on and so forth. But I thought I'd like to throw in just a poem, if I might. I know that Joe has only just seen the poem and may well think a little bit differently. But just to show how complicated this idea of a kamikaze pilot who survives becomes. It's a poem by an English poet, a woman called Beatrice Garland. And I thought I'd just try and read it and see if it makes... See if it adds some flesh to what we're trying to talk about. Because the samurai and the kamikaze in particular are not easy to understand in simple terms. So it's called Kamikaze, the special, the divine wind. Okay. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and just enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats, strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. And beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag, waved first one way, then the other way, in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun. And remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, sweaty with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. And the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So it puts a real boy who's grown up in a fishing village somewhere in Japan, who's sent out, and halfway through, Grace Darling sees him as deciding not to go, deciding to go for life. But he comes back and he's living in this changed world because the fact that he comes back means that people treat him as though he had died. And he's killed himself. It's that conundrum of if you go, you die. If you stay, you die. So which death do you choose? Joe, I'll let you give the romantic line. Whatever. How do you? Does it do that for you? Does it?
I'm afraid that this poem doesn't do much for me. I'm afraid. I think the introduction is, to me, quite Orientalist. There's a real, I think, sense of fantasy within that, and I suppose as a curator who's worked with Yoshida's work and these other artists, one of which is still alive, Hayashi Yasuo, who actually makes these beautiful and powerful ceramic sculptures about flying at night, doing these practice flights. I think for me, I don't necessarily think about these artists' experience within Japan immediately following the war. I think a lot more about what they were experiencing within it. And I find with Yoshida's work, the use of black is so interesting. And then you have this other artist who is also making these black ceramic sculptures, reflecting on flying over the sea at night. And so I thought it was quite interesting that this poet has decided to describe flying over the sea in such a sort of fanciful, beautiful way. The language is really sort of languid, and yet I don't see that when I look at the works by the artists who were doing those actions. So I think for me there's a bit of a disconnect between the poem and its structure and its language versus what the emotion that I feel when I look at Yoshida's work or Hayashi's work, which I think is more direct to a lived experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let me come back to that. We're not going to get into practical criticism of Grace. No.
I mean, it is its own work. It is
its own work. But the other day, when the show was opened, we had David Elliott, who gave a wonderful introduction to the exhibition and was talking about the same thing, that Yoshida had therefore survived this terribly intense series of probably 4 or 5 months when he didn't know whether he was going to live the next day or die the next day. And there's this terrible intensity. Life is just too much. And as Yoshida himself says in his notebooks, death, what is it? So there's this contrast between life and death, which certainly appears in the works. But David Elliott said something very interesting. He said that it's possible to see in the works, and he used the word trauma. Now, I've never at all seen trauma in the works. So the question for me is, how does Yoshida take that intensity and transform it into something that both uses the experience of that traumatic... There's no doubt the experience was traumatic, but I don't think that the work is traumatic.
Yes, I think Yoshida said, what was it? We need to accept about life and death, and then out of that comes colour. And I think that those moments within the Second World War of having to confront life and death so viscerally, I think that does impact you. And I think that expectation of ultimately it is going to end in death. And no matter whether you can accept that or not, I think then being given another life, as I say, is very transformative. And every kind of transformation that you go through, you lose a part of yourself. You have to enter into a different version of yourself. And I think that can be a very traumatic experience. And then within these works, I think that there is a lot to say about rebuilding, being reborn, and that is something quite overwhelming to endure. And I think you can really see that actually through the collection of works that you have here. You have some early works from the 70s, and what I really like about them are the looseness. They are primordial. And then you get to works like the one behind me, which is from the 2000s, and that's actually, it's much more fixed. The lines are not bleeding. They are... there's a defined space, there's a defined form, whereas in those earlier works, it's about layering and that sort of oozing, and I think there's something solidifying throughout Kenji's oeuvre. And when you think that it's always named la vie, the life, they are one development, one continuous development of an individual. So I think there are lots of very interesting ideas within that, and I can't speak for David's comment about being able to visibly see trauma.
Do you, in a sense, when he said that, I looked and thought, I'm still kind of looking. So I was fascinated to hear him say that. And nobody I know has seen that, but he's not wrong.
I think I see much more about healing than I think about trauma. But I think maybe David's commenting on what are you healing from?
Well, to pick up that, because I think the next thing then to say is that when he returns to life, I love Joe's idea about this second life. I think it's a very important one, and I've adopted it because I think it's fascinating. So the post-war, rather than the broken Japan, which was completely annihilated, flattened, and for Japan to turn around from 45 to in 65 to host, or 64 to hosting the Olympics and to being part of the new emergent Japan is the most amazing transformation of any country. But Yoshida, in that same 64, Yoshida goes back to teaching, and he throws himself back into his art. And there's a sense, I think, in which throwing himself back into his art is part of that healing process, has to be part of that healing process. And then he makes a huge break, and this is one of the things which I see this as the kinds of pressure that he was feeling from the Japanese people around him is what makes him think, I can't live here because I'm living somebody else's reality of who I am, if you like. I'm living a social construct of I'm a failed kamikaze pilot. He needs to get out of there. And he makes the break and he leaves Japan. And he almost doesn't go back. He goes back 2 times, I think, short visits, to feel Japan again. And then he goes back just before he dies. But he lives for the next 44 years in Paris. David, again, made a wonderful comment about in Paris you have existentialism, you have Sartre, you have a completely different philosophical bent to what's happening in Japan. And I also see, and I'd love your thinking on this one, he also becomes part, rather than of the Japanese reflection of the Western art world, he becomes in Paris part of the Grande Old Dame herself, Paris, the centre of the Western art world, at least until the war. And then he's also in touch with what's happening in New York. He, through Stanley Hayter, who was the printmaker he worked with, he's in touch with what's happening with the abstract expressionists. And this huge influx of European thinking begins to enter into his art. So the prints that you're talking about, Joe, in the other room, are very much from that period. He arrives in 64, and 64 to 75, he's working in printing. He's exploring things, exploring ideas, exploring who he is as an artist, and so on and so forth. It's a fascinating period.
Yes, and at the moment in London, there's another exhibition about other Japanese artists who are working in Paris in the 1970s. You've got Matsutani and Tatsumi Kudo. And it's very interesting that none of them have a cohesive style. None of them have a cohesive intellectual language that they're sharing. They're all exploring these very different ideas. And yet they are similar in the sense that they have emigrated into this city. And I think, I can't remember who it was, whether it was Matsutani or Kudo, whether one of them said that they really wanted to go to New York, but they didn't get the funding for that, so they ended up in Paris. And so I think it's this fascinating draw to Paris, which is losing a little bit of its prestige. And so what are these artists who are coming from Japan doing with that city and that art scene? That's very interesting. And as you say, exploring those different philosophies. And I think in a very postmodern sense, that idea that every artist has to speak to their own ethnicity, I think that's also quite interesting, and maybe something that gets very overlaid on all 3 of them. But I think particularly with Yoshida and the types of materials that he's working with, there's this connection to his Japanese byobu, or folding screens with the gold and silver leaf, or the black calligraphy ink that you can see on a lot of his works. But then I think working in Paris in this international art scene, can you separate them out? Is it actually speaking to something else? Yoshida said, again, about this idea of having this universe, the universe, the gods are shouting about life, how to live it fully, that life is precious, it's fun, and we need to take advantage of it. He said that when he discovered metals, he discovered a way to reflect that voice. So is it actually not even a reference to traditional Japanese art form at all? Is it actually speaking to something that's much more philosophical at that kind of French existentialist level? And then again, with this blackness, is it about calligraphy, or is it actually just about that ever-pervasive presence of death? And I think coming from that, the ideas of like flying at night, doing these practice flights that Hayashi Yasuo has talked about, or the idea of having this second life, and like enduring a time where you thought the only thing that was going to happen to you was death. I think actually when you start to draw it apart, there is that very postmodern relationship of is Yoshida just talking about himself as an individual and shouting to the collective?
rabbits to chase. It's too many. You can see, I think, in this exhibition, Elizabeth, the artistic director, and Hilary have put together an exhibition that begins with some of the early prints, and as Joey's saying, they're of a different kind. Take a look at them. Yoshida, when he gets to Paris, goes to work with a rather remarkable Englishman called Stanley Hayter. And Hayter had been part of the surrealist group in Paris. He was interested in Dada. He was born in Clapham, just to give him a route. And it's a route that he throws away and goes to live in Paris. And he sets up, and it's 100 years ago this year, he sets up in 1926 a print studio. Now, Hayter's crucially important, and almost many people have never heard of him, but he's important because he taught printing to almost any artist you do know, any artist you want to name. Picasso, yes. Braque, yes. Miro, yes. Just goes through them. Modigliani, yes. Louis Bourgeois, yes, but not in Paris. He escapes during the war because the Germans have got Paris during the war. Hayter escapes to New York. In New York, what's he doing? He's teaching printing, and he has a very particular printing style. He doesn't think of printing as the creation of reproductions of things, so 50 examples of the same thing. For Hayter, every single print is a unique object, and you work on the plate. You're painting on the plate. So each time you print, it's something different. So a very creative view of how to print. We wouldn't have many of Picasso's prints if it weren't for Hayter. In New York, he's teaching. Who's he teaching in New York? He's teaching Motherwell. He's teaching Rothko. He's teaching Jackson Pollock what to print. He's trying to push the artists to recognize the creativity that comes from print itself. Yeah? So a fascinating character in and of himself. And Yoshida becomes very, very close to Hayter, and you can see there are many pictures of him working with Hayter. He then, I think, he's got out of Japan. He's plugged... Sorry, the reason I said that is because through Hayter, who returns from New York to Paris in 1955, so Yoshida turns up 9 years later, he reestablishes his printing studio, Atelier 17, the 17th atelier. He reestablishes it, and all these artists now want to work with Hayter. And Yoshida slips in. As soon as he arrives, his friend says, "Come, I'll take you to Hayter's place." And he begins to work with Hayter. The early print work that you can see through there, as Joe says, it has a fluidity. There are layers. There's a layered... you see, is it a rising sun coming through clouds? You see Japanese symbols, the rising sun, I'm saying. You still begin to see him already beginning to work with gold and silver paint. And I think this is him looking for a path that eventually becomes this part of the traditional Japanese consciousness, if you like, the gold leaf. But you see him working on the plate with gold and silver paints. And it's that link into these later works that I find most interesting.
Yeah, I think there's something about Yoshida's work where it's about that evolution. It's sort of like you have the sort of cells that then evolve into a full body. And I think the early works are quite interesting as well. There are two paintings in there where you have gold ground and is then painted on top. And they do look like kind of galaxies. There's this sort of sense of this, I don't know, cosmic universe, and where do we sit within that? But it's interesting that later on it's all about applying gold on top. It's this sort of inversion that happens, and yeah, there's something quite fascinating about that. And one of my favorite works is actually it's over in the corner over there. It's got this amorphous black oval on top of or surrounded by silver, but that silver is clearly applied onto gold or red, and it's building up this very layered image, but it actually looks very flat when you see it. And I think that that idea of hidden depths, that idea of experiencing a universe behind a single sheet. It's almost like you're encountering an individual. You get that first encounter without words, without identity, and you have that judgment, and then you start to see through conversation, through experience, many more layers to it, and even the black from a distance it looks flat, but when you get up close it's heavily textured, and it's textured by agency. It's but a choice of Yoshida to create this surface. And so I think that there's this very interesting relationship to how did Yoshida develop his surface from something primordial, loose, layered, into something fixed. And again, at the opening, there was a lot of talk about Yoshida's visits in the 90s to Mexico. And he mentions actually encountering the unknown through that. So there's this idea of going into spaces and seeing how other cultures, whether through music, dance, painting, sculpture, they're all trying to scream the same thing about existence, about life. And so he sort of said how that expanded his perception of the infinite in a way, that everybody is aware of these different ideas, but there's no cohesive way to express them. And so I think he's trying to work out how to speak to that universe through these works, through these gestural marks. And I've never met Yoshida, and you have. So this is quite an interesting conversation, because I'm speaking about it purely as somebody who's experienced the works and has studied it and tried to devour as much as I can about the person. But you've met him, and you were saying how he's very gestural in how he talks, how he tries to engage about the works, and I found that very interesting, that the work of art in itself is an expression, and that it's actually trying to encapsulate something that's within somebody. It's almost like this is an outcome of a performance art, and the performance art is the life.
I think that there's something fascinating in Yoshida, having got out of Japan. The Japanese are a wonderfully contained. I hope this makes sense. Are a wonderful. I know I have Japanese friends in the audience. A wonderfully contained group, in the sense that there is a very definite surface tension that keeps people on the inside of the Japanese culture. They did it for 300 years during the Tokugawa period, when they just closed themselves off to the outside world. Now, when Meiji happens and they suddenly go out and start picking up bits of other cultures and pulling them back and taking them back into Japan, that was a very important period. But I don't think the Japanese go abroad very easily. I don't think they encounter other cultures very easily. And Yoshida seems to me to be un-Japanese in precisely that sense. I think in Paris, he fits more almost into the bohemian. He was a man who was out there, and he traveled. He goes to the Middle East. A Japanese person going to Israel and spending 3 months on a kibbutz. He didn't speak Yiddish. He didn't speak very much English. He didn't speak very much French. I jokingly say his Japanese was attenuating by the time he'd been outside of Japan for 40 years. It didn't matter to Yoshida that he couldn't speak a language. He emoted, he gestured, he let people know that he was there. And I think he got on for 3 months in this kibbutz. He got on, they all loved him. He worked alongside them. He leaves there, he goes to Syria. He leaves Syria, he goes to Lebanon. Same again. He didn't speak Arabic at all. He had wonderful times there. He goes to Cuba, he goes to Mexico. And in Mexico, he meets, what I loved your point there, Joe. He meets the Mayan culture. And it's all about the sun. It's about the light. It's about these ancient Mayan symbols, the Mayan ziggurats and the Mayan sculptures, the seated powerful gods and things. Yoshida is ecstatic. And you in the British Museum have got Yoshida's Mayan sequence of scrolls, where he's borrowing symbols from a completely different culture and making things that ultimately you think it's squares and circles, and it's squares and circles interacting. It's the beginnings of a big part of his symbolic language. Yeah, it comes from the Mayans. He found in this other culture echoes of things that he was thinking, and he absorbed them. He brings them to his work. So he's an amazing bohemian, peripatetic artist in some way that is not distinctively Japanese, I'd say.
Yes, I mean, there's so much to unpack in that about Japaneseness, I suppose, and whether that can even be. But it's just his work is so responsive, and this might allude to something I've already said, but that idea about the work evolving with him through experience, and I think that there's a growing confidence to try and convey a message, and this idea of having a single series for your whole body of work might inform that as well.
Yes, so you're talking about in 78 or 79, thereabouts, he decides, I'm not going to call my things the roots of life or life's treasures anymore. I'm not going to call it meditation. I'm not going to give individual works individual titles. I'm just going to call it life. It is life. And he uses life as a Japanese word, inochi. He uses it as a French word, la vie. And in English, it's just life. But there's the other side too. There's life and peace, inochi to heiwa. And there's this wonderful phrase which he puts out that life brightens most when peace happens, when peace occurs. Peace,
I think
peace
that's so important, and I think that that's one of the reasons why Yoshida's work now has such a big resonance. I think. And actually, it's very interesting, all the works that we have in the Samurai exhibition that are reflecting on war, the ultimate message is about peace. And even though I've said that there isn't this connectivity between the artist working in that post-war period, that idea of peace is so prevalent. And conceptualizing what has happened, understanding it, and now I think with all of the uncertainty in our world, whether it's financial, technological, or even related to the dissolution of peace, these works take on new resonances today. And I definitely feel that. I think when I look at them, there is this call for we all experience life. We all are blessed with life. Maybe that's too much of a religious term to use, blessed, but we all happen to exist, and that is extraordinary. And I think for Yoshida, the idea of that almost being taken away through other people's orders, through other people's control of life, there is a sense, I think, in these works of being out of control. It's about that continuous movement, continuous living, and that we all share in life, but we don't, because it is cut short by the boundaries around our countries, by the systems of power that we have to exist within. And I think his ability to go from country to country and absorb and embed himself within cultures, despite not having that shared language, I think it's a testament to what can happen within a peaceful life.
I pick up on that and would say that I think that it didn't matter that Yoshida didn't speak these languages, because you said the universes that he creates, and they're being, as it were, symbolic universes and symbols of the universal. I think he could get by fine with other people because he was expressing something that everybody had and everybody recognizes. And so there's you could almost see Yoshida as a European formalist. He has circles, he has ovals, he has squares, he puts formal symbols on the canvas. That's not it comes out of Russian, the Russian 20s and things. So formal abstraction, let's call it. That for Yoshida isn't enough, I don't think. For Yoshida, those formal symbols have got to have very, very powerful, deep meanings that we all understand.
But it's not just form as well, it's also the colour.
Right.
I mean, this is what I wanted to ask you about, is your response to the changing forms and the changing colours, because they do develop across the works.
What I'd say to that, Joe, I think one of the places I begin with any Yoshida is, let's just take one at random, over behind there, the red thing. I'm always looking for, or the large blue behind us on the wall there. I'm always looking for what I think is central to Yoshida, and it's the yin-yang symbol. It's the twin fish or the triple fish of the Korean universe. The two forms. I have to put my microphone down. The two forms that do that. And then in any yin-yang symbol, the forms change into each other. They chase each other. They chase each other's tail, let's say. So for me, Yoshida exists inside this antinomial universe. There are, as you said, the black oval shape is bounded by a silver circumference of sorts. There's colours and things underneath. If you look at what he's doing behind, he's putting oil paint underneath the gold. So that just see behind the cameras there's just this huge yin-yang symbol. The gold is moving into the silver, and the silver is returning. It's being pushed out, and it's moving into the gold. But he's also getting colour beneath, coming through the gold. Now, he's doing that because he's putting oil paint underneath, and he's using different coloured oil paints. So the golds themselves begin to give you different colours. Under these, you have reds, and you have silvers, and then the silver. So the colours he's putting underneath, again, begin to change. So what I find fascinating is that I like that you say about this, Joe, that it has a stability to it. Because I think that by this time, by the late work, Yoshida has these, as it were, frozen snapshots of the universe itself in movement, in slow, like the grand, the skyscape that moves, but you don't see it moving. It is moving, but you don't see it. I think that by the time he's got to here, the movement is provided almost by the eye of the beholder. They're frozen, but they're not frozen. You see them changing.
Well, yes, I think for me, when you look at the development, it becomes a declaration of somebody who feels like he understands his universe and his place in that universe. And I think the colours underneath, they make the layering, they make the colours on top change. It's sort of, there's something unstable about them at the same time as being stable. But that's all to do with how you're looking at them and what angle are you looking at them at. And that movement comes from you as the viewer moving around it. And that's really what I meant at the beginning of this talk when I was sort of saying he's trying to let the universal voice speak through the works. It's actually trying to come out of the canvas, out of the picture plane and into our lives. And so the viewer becomes very much part of the work. Yeah.
I always say that and many people don't know this, but I'm sure there are a couple of Oriental experts, I can see a few in the audience. There are only two things. Most things go from China to Japan, in the same sense in which most things go from the continental Europe to the island of Britain, with the Roman and the Greco-Roman influence and so on. On the other side of the world, China was the great Oriental superpower, and its ideas penetrate through Buddhism. They come into Japan. All the language comes from Europe. Language comes from China into the island nation. There are only two things that go in the other direction, and one of them is the folding fan, which is a purely Japanese invention, because the Chinese have a fan which is static. It's a circle. And to the Japanese, that was too big, and you couldn't carry this thing around all day. So they developed the folding fan, put it away. The other thing is, that's just to tell you, we're getting close to closing. The other thing is gold leaf. And the reason that the Japanese invented, if you like, gold leaf was because they had such scarce amounts of the material. So if you found gold in Japan, you would beat it into, as John Donne said, airy thinness. And then you'd put it on the statue of the Buddha in a temple. You'd take this tiny bit of gold and you'd stretch it so it would cover the entire statue. And then you could put a little candle in front of that statue. And in the dark, the Buddha figure would move as the shadows moved. And I think Yoshida blatantly and knowingly is operating that ancient Japanese insight trick, call it what you like. Because if anybody, I have been involved in several sales. If anybody buys a Yoshida and it has the gold and the silver and the platinum, the copper he uses too, I always advise them to put it on a wall that faces south. Because during the day, as the sun rises and moves across the sky, at any time you come into that room and you see the Yoshida, you do not see the same picture twice. Because the light changing on the surface and the inky blackness and the colours, the reds, the greens, the blues, they change together with the reflections of the sunlight on them. So they're almost, for me, I see Yoshida, I have a huge respect for him. They're almost religious objects. And I think you mentioned that it's not, do we talk about religion here? I think with Yoshida we need to talk about the spiritual. Because there is no doubt that he was a deeply spiritual person. Shinto, Buddhist, he was Japanese, so he would do either, it didn't really matter. But for Yoshida, as he says, as you were saying, Joe, he sees in the metal something that to him implies Godhead, something other than the human. And so it's spiritual. When he's using silver, when he's using gold, he's talking about something that's outside of the human world.
Yes, I think we haven't really talked about Yoshida's appreciation or engagement with Buddhism and other spiritual practices. And he does talk about gods a lot. And so even though maybe I'm projecting like the sort of non-religious context onto the work, very 21st century of me, but it is, I think for him, the gods are this universal experience. And I don't think he means it as in a specific group, but that idea of something beyond humanity. And maybe, I mean, I think that's what I've always thought about his second life, is it's almost this detached life, one that is so aware of the fragility of existence and how that can be snatched away, not even by your own control. So to have an opportunity to live is to really be engaged with a higher plane of thinking. And I think that higher plane is really this idea of the gods and their voice, and whether that's access through Buddhism, Shintoism, ancient Mayan traditions. It's one of those sort of universal experiences.
I think that's it. I think if Yoshida has a meaning today, he's saying to us, life, it is about life. Be it, feel it, do it. Yeah,
and I think that's something that is we are struggling with so much today. everybody in the room now, we don't know whose decision is going to take our lives in a completely new direction. There's a powerlessness that I think everybody is sharing, and that's magnified by the fact that we can see it so immediately through social media and the news, and it's so overwhelming. And actually, there's this desire to be connected with each other, and I think Yoshida Kenji's work can offer some sort of solace or advice and connectivity. Have the gold sort of shine down on you, and maybe that can inspire some kind of transcendental connectivity.
You see what I'm saying? As soon as Joe walked into the booth we had at Freeze Masters and he started talking like this, I thought, look, this is somebody who actually looks, sees, and feels what is out there. So, Joe, I could go on talking like this, and we could keep going for another hour. But I know there are people out there who might have a few questions, or I know there are people out there who actually knew Yoshida, and I would love to hear a little vignette or a little story, if you remember him.
Oh, I met him here.
You met him here?
Yeah, and he's because I'm Japanese, so I'm also artist. Sorry. So I met him here when I came to his exhibition, not knowing him. And then, I just said hello in Japanese. And then we made little friends. He sent a few letters to me, exchanging the letters. So I had a very nice, warm feeling towards him. I regretted not visiting him in Paris because he invited me to come over. I was quite, I'm introvert and a bit shy, so
Yes.
I didn't go.
No, I think...
I didn't know he was a kamikaze.
He wouldn't tell you. He wouldn't tell you. Yeah. No.
Well, my uncle, my father's older brother, he was a kamikaze. The day he was in the mission, war finished, so he came back home.
He did come back home?
Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
But he worked really hard for the country.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Oh, wow.
Well, they don't talk. My parents doesn't talk.
They don't talk about that
talk.
period, no.
My grandfather, he's artist, kimono weaver. He doesn't talk. He actually, he didn't want to go to war.
Yes.
So he became, I think in Japan at the time, if you are recognized artist in some certain way, you can skip not to go.
You didn't have to go to war. This is correct. And also there were, as in the West, there were war artists. So Fujita goes back from Paris to Japan during the war, and he works as a war artist. Joe was telling me about some of his pictures the other day, and then he returns to Paris. So one of Japan's great, if you like, École de Paris, the Parisian school.
It's very interesting to learn about all this because in Japan we talk.
And Yoshida's art teacher before the war said, don't pick up rifles, pick up paintbrushes. And so I think that it's very interesting that artistic challenge to the militarism of the time, and that militarism extends back very far, to the 1910s. And so I think art was a real tool of challenge for the government. And it's very interesting how censorious the government became against artists. And so it became very hard to talk about it. And I think that it's something that needs a big reflection, that interwar artistic expression.
Maybe it was too painful.
Yes, I'm sure. There's just on that. I don't know. Do you know, Joe? There's a book called An Artist of the Floating World, which is by Ishiguro Kazuo, and it's the story of an artist, and you learn. It's post-war, but you learn as he reveals who he is in talking about his growing family, you learn that he had been an artist during the war and he receives official favor. But then you realize that he was actually a great supporter of Japan's military drive. And so that was why his art was sold very well and supported. And there are other artists who were not supported because they took the opposite position and so on. It's a very interesting analysis of post-war Japanese, what had happened during the war, the artists being separated into two camps.
Then as well, we must get back to talk about Yoshida, but just very quickly to say it's quite interesting Yoshida's age, being 19, going into conscription, versus other artists who had been working in the 20s and 30s. You know, they were going into the war in their 30s and 40s, and a lot of the people who survived the war, their subversive, countercultural artwork or motivation to create that artwork didn't survive. A lot of their work after the war became very pictorial, about realism, and I think that speaks a bit to that. It's too painful to talk about. Whereas I think there's perhaps a vitality and a fire within Yoshida to be able to confront those ideas because of his youth. Rather than people who were older and encountering the war. I think there's maybe a difference in that.
Mm. Stephen, I'm going to. Could I put you on the spot? Stephen just turns up today, and he's come from Devon. Stephen worked here in the 90s at the October Gallery, and he actually worked with Yoshida on Yoshida shows. Please, just a little vignette, Stephen. Anyone?
I worked with him for a short while, and was greatly influenced by his persona and how gentle and what a kind man he was. But I do remember going to he put on a workshop for various people, and a little artist workshop. And one thing that I still remember and I still actually use in my own work is this way of drawing a line. So he would always say, he said specifically that when a line is being drawn, you never sort of just let the line go. You've got to draw the line, and you have to finish the line with intent. So and I find that really, and in doing that, in making work, is just an amazing thing, because I have that kind of, if I'm drawing a line, I have that thought of Kenji when I'm drawing that line, and I finish it because I was taught to draw that line with that finish, with that kind of dot at the end, and I love doing that. That's one, and another anecdote which is just maybe can express his spiritual or intuitive nature. I was sitting in the office with Jose one morning, and they'd just come back from Mexico, and the previous night I'd been really disturbed with a dream that had, I was confronting the devil, and I had this devil dream. It's really quite disturbing. But then as soon as Kenji came into the office and saw me sitting there, he just disappeared immediately, and he came back down without we hadn't spoken. He disappeared, and he came back and gave me this little demon figure, little metal demon that he'd bought in Mexico, and he gave that to me then. So I don't know, it was just really amazing and sort of really quite special moment. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's really lovely to hear authentic, from the Yoshida stories. Most people meet him, I think, through the art, which is a wonderful way to meet him, I think, because you have all these things synthesized into these wonderful tableaux. But I always just remember the immense energy. He was a small little Japanese figure. The idea of a samurai or a kamikaze or so on, just very small, very, very humble. But there was an energy to the being that you couldn't miss. And I always say that if I said to him, so Sensei, what is this about? He wouldn't try to explain it, because it is in some sense its own explanation. He leaves the explanation to me to find in the painting. But any number of times I saw him, he would dance the painting for you. I'm going to give the microphone up. I am not he, but he would do. And was that what the painting was about? But he wanted to show that it meant something real. You just had to find out what it was. So
That's really on you.
that's it. Put it right back to you. Put it right back to you. But he wanted to communicate that it was something, but you had to find out what it was. That was the answer that you found. I'm breathless and excited, and say a huge thanks, Joe, for coming and talking about Yoshida Sensei. And thank you to all of you for arriving and enjoying, hopefully, our little conversation.
Yes, no, thank you so much. This has been very insightful, and I've loved hearing those experiences that you had with Yoshida. As I said, I've never met the artist, so those moments of experience are so interesting to me as somebody who's just been swept away by the artistry. But the Samurai exhibition is on until the 4th of May. Sorry to plug it, but I'd be really intrigued if you go and see it, and then you see Yoshida's work and how that might feel now, having seen the work on display here. We also have a work of Yoshida's up in the Japan galleries at the moment, and there'll be another one put on display in April as well.
Oh, great. I would wholly endorse what Joe is saying. The Samurai, it's a full show with lots of things. But I also love the fact you've chosen a Yoshida that wouldn't necessarily fit into this particular exhibition. It's sober, it's somber, it's restrained, and there's something very, very, iconographically speaking, design speak, there's something extremely Japanese to it.
Well, it's called Le Moment Décisif, and I think that was very interesting. As I say, we're trying to reflect upon the war in this case, and so I just felt that there were so many moments that Yoshida must have had to reflect upon, decisions to be made, the decisive moment. And I think when we're considering that idea of between life and death, and whether that's a choice that anybody actually has, I just was really inspired, and it really made me reconsider a lot about realities of war, and so I think that's why we chose it. And you'll see if you go, it's this black ground, and then there's this silver triangle that's very kind of aggressive, and then there's this gold swirling shape that goes over the top of it, and it just made me think about many paths that we have to experience and choices that we have to make. And I think maybe after the conversations that we've had today, those choices might become more vague or more specific. I don't know.
We can't tell. And just to follow on this, finally, I'd like to say we also have an old friend of Yoshida Sensei's who did know him very well, Joji Hiroto, who lives in London, and he has a group called the Taiko Drummers, who's coming along to give a concert. I first met Joji when he came to a Yoshida show, and he wanted everybody to leave the gallery so he could play the flute, the shakuhachi, to Yoshida, and he just tootled for about half an hour, and then he'd communed, and so people could go back into the gallery again. But he's coming to invigorate the gallery space again on, when is it? On 20th. So if you'd be interested in that, Joji is a rather remarkable person too, a wonderful Japanese musician. He'll be playing drums and, I hope, shakuhachi. See if we can raise the spirit of Yoshida in these halls once again. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.